Hello, I am Juvina from Wright State University. I am pleased to be here today, the 25th of July, 2020, at the 27th Annual ACT R Workshop. My talk today is about modeling peer effects in interactive learning. This work has been going on for a few years and has benefited from my collaboration with Otalia Lariu, Peter Crow, Jerry Carson, and Kevin O'Neill. Let me start with some background and significance. Much of human learning occurs through interaction with the task environment and other learners, including experts, because experts can be seen as learners who are more advanced in their learning than other learners. If we assume that knowledge is distributed in the world and in other minds, then learners can tap into the richness and diversity of knowledge through interaction. However, knowledge can be incomplete, erroneous, or biased, and learners must verify, validate, and filter the knowledge gathered from others. Learning through interaction with others has the potential to enhance our collective intelligence. Collective intelligence has been shown to predict twice as much variance as individual intelligence in complex criteria such as solving architectural design problems. Active learning pedagogies that emphasize learner-centeredness and interaction among learners show evidence of improved learning outcomes. However, this evidence comes from field studies or quasi-experiments that are not always replicable. For example, my colleagues and I documented the effects of a somewhat natural experiment. When the School of Nursing at Wright State University started implementing the team-based learning pedagogy in 2011, nursing students started to score above the national average in standardized tests. However, this evidence is difficult to replicate and it may be fraught with confounders. For example, I noticed that the teachers who adopted TBL were also strong believers in TBL and they were working hard to make it successful. There is a need for controlled lab experiments to establish causality and understand the mechanisms that are responsible for the observed effects. In addition, computational cognitive modeling can help with finding explanatory mechanisms, generalization, theory building, and transitioning to applied areas such as human-machine teaming. So we set out to conduct a controlled lab experiment called the PAL study. The goal was to understand the mechanisms and outcomes of peer-assisted learning, abbreviated as PAL. The task we used was the Paired Associated Learning task, also abbreviated as PAL. The participants had to memorize 60 arbitrary word number pairs. The key contrasts were individual versus peer-assisted learning and passive versus active learning. There were 3 between subjects conditions. In the PAL condition, there were groups of 4 learners interacting among each other. In the individual interactive learning condition, the learners would interact with the learning material. They would generate answers and receive feedback. In the passive learning condition, the learners would just observe the stimuli and the correct answers. They would not have the opportunity to generate their own answers. There were 6 within subjects non-independent learning sessions. Each session included a mix of old and new items. Each session was composed of home time and school time. In home time, students could choose to do a relaxation activity or study for school time. We used the amount of studying in home time as a measure of motivation for learning. After 6 sessions, there was a short break and a final exam that was administered individually and tested the retention of the 60 word number pairs. In school time, the learning procedure was specific to each between subjects condition. In the passive learning condition, the participants saw a word and then the associated number, then another word followed by its associate, and so on. In the individual interactive learning condition, the participants saw a word, then they generated a number, then they saw the correct number, and so on. In the PAL condition, the participants saw a word, then they generated a number as their first answer, then they were allowed to look at their peers' answers and take one of them if they wanted to. Then they saw the correct number and the cycle was repeated until the end of school time. We hypothesized that the active learning conditions would outperform the passive learning condition, and the PAL condition would outperform the individual interactive learning condition. This was based on our study with the nursing students and many other studies showing the superiority of active and interactive pedagogies. We hypothesized that group performance would be higher than individual performance. This was based on many studies showing wisdom of crowds or collective intelligence effects. We also hypothesized that effort, that is the amount of time spent in home, the amount of practice in home time, would be lower in the PAL condition, a social loafing effect. The graduate student who ran the study expected to see this. I had a two-tailed hypothesis here, allowing for the possibility of both social loafing and its opposite, social facilitation. This was based on reports from the nursing study. Many participants reported that they spent more time studying at home when they expected to interact with their peers at school. We expected that peer inspection data will be informative with regard to the explanatory mechanisms of peer-assisted learning. Before I show the results of this empirical study, allow me to show what we predicted a few years ago before the study was run. The predictions were generated by an ACT R model developed by Otalia Larue and myself and presented at a previous ACT R workshop, which some of you might remember. The model predicted that the PAL condition, here shown as TBL, will significantly outperform the individual interactive learning condition, here shown as active learning, AL, and the passive learning condition, PL. This model is an extension of the well-known model of paired associates learning developed by John Anderson in 1981 and included in the standard ACT R tutorial. We added a peer-assisted learning component, and I'm only showing a diagram of the process here. The model reads and encodes the stimulus, and if it's not required to respond, as in the passive learning condition, it reads the correct response, and then it associates the correct response to the stimulus and reinforces the associate in memory. If it is required to respond, then it attempts to retrieve a word number pair or an associate, and if it cannot retrieve, then it randomly guesses, and if it can retrieve, then it uses that retrieved associate to generate the response, then it reads the correct response, forms an associate, and reinforce that associate in memory. If it can also look at the peer's answers, as in the PAL condition, it selects a peer to look at based on peer reputation or trustworthiness. It looks at the peer response and creates and reinforces an associate in memory. If the peer response is correct, it triggers a positive reward signal and learn peer trust. If the peer response is incorrect, it triggers a negative reward signal and learns peer distrust. Then it moves on and generates a response and reads the correct response and forms the correct associates in memory. Here are the results of the empirical study. I'm showing accuracy by condition and session and school time. The dark solid line is the PAL condition, the red dashed line is the individual interactive learning condition, and the green dot is the passive learning condition. Notice that we only have accuracy data for the passive learning condition at test in session 7 because subjects did not generate an answer in sessions 1 through 6. The PAL data are broken down into first answer accuracy, second answer accuracy, and group answer accuracy. The group answer is the thin line on top of all the others. The group answer is computed as the mode of individual second answers. We see that accuracy in the PAL condition is not higher than in the individual learning condition. At test, in session 7, accuracy is actually lower in the PAL condition than in the individual learning condition, contrary to what we predicted. The group answer is more accurate than the individual answer. This effect could be a wisdom of crowds effect, a simple aggregation effect, a knowledge spillover effect, or both. It is more likely a knowledge spillover effect because, as you see, the second answer is already much more accurate than the first one. Given the knowledge spillover effect, why did the PAL condition not perform better at test? Here we are directly testing the peer effect. We are looking at a positive correlation between learner accuracy in session n and maximum peer accuracy in session n-1. We found that a 1 unit increase in peer accuracy causes a quarter unit increase in learner accuracy. Thus, interacting with a knowledgeable peer in the previous session causes improved accuracy in the current session and vice versa. Even though the effect size is small, this indicates a significant peer effect. However, peers can have positive and negative effects that may cancel each other in the average. Here we're testing whether learners have any control over their peers' influences. We're looking at the frequency of taking a peer's answer, the accuracy of that answer, and the accuracy of the learner's own answer. Taking a peer's answers occurs quite frequently, even though it slightly decreases with learning, the black line. Taking a peer's answer generally occurs when learner accuracy is low, though increasing, the red line. In general, learners become increasingly able to recognize accurate responses in their peers and take them, the green line. However, sometimes they take inaccurate responses from their peers. You see how the green line does not reach the ceiling. Here, we're looking at how long the participants studied at home in each condition. We see that the participants in the PAL condition did not study less at home. Thus, social loafing cannot explain their poor performance at test. In fact, they studied significantly more than the other conditions. Home time practice is correlated with test performance, particularly in the PAL condition. The correlation is 0.68. Thus, these findings are consistent with an overall positive peer effect acting via two channels, knowledge and motivation. Why does this effect not lead to better test performance? Peer inspection data may give us a clue. We use the mouse tracking procedure to record what peers were looking at. This is sometimes called a poor man's eye tracking procedure. We see that in the PAL condition, learners are exposed to roughly as many incorrect responses as correct ones. Even though they are able to distinguish the correct ones during the learning sessions, the incorrect associates may persist in memory and interfere with the retrieval of correct responses at test. Thus, the positive peer effect might be offset by a negative interference effect. The number of non-answers vary widely between conditions. It is about 5% in the PAL condition and 0.3% in the individual interactive learning condition. One possible explanation for this discrepancy is that the workload is much higher in the PAL condition than in the individual interactive learning condition. Non-answers predict poor test performance, suggesting that workload explains part of the poorer performance in the PAL condition. When non-answers are included as a covariate, the difference between the two conditions becomes non-significant. To summarize, we find a positive peer effect acting via knowledge spillover among peers and increased willingness to practice in the PAL condition. This positive peer effect is offset by a negative peer effect acting via exposure to incorrect responses and increased workload in the PAL condition. How to model these effects? I think minor refinements of the current ACT R model can handle increased workload in the PAL condition, knowledge spillover among peers, exposure to incorrect responses, learning peer trustworthiness. However, a new mechanism is needed to account for increased willingness to practice in the PAL condition. I have a very preliminary idea of what this new mechanism should look like. Here is a sketch of a process model for the motivation channel. The model selects a level of effort or an amount of practice, and if it's not required to respond, as in the passive learning condition, it reads the correct response and gets extrinsic reward if this response is correct. If it is required to respond, the model responds and gets intrinsic reward from this response. Just by being able to respond correctly, this generates an intrinsic reward. If peers can see your answer, the model forms sophisticated beliefs about peers. For example, it estimates their level of effort and adjusts its own level of effort to coordinate with peers. If a coordination equilibrium is reached, then the model gets a positive social reward. If the equilibrium is not reached, the model gets a negative social reward, and this reward is used to reinforce the selected level of effort, and also the net effect, considering that effort is correlated with performance, the net effect is an increase of effort in the PAL condition. We have a series of studies in progress on knowledge-based reasoning and problem solving with a focus on interactive and peer-assisted learning. The RAT-PAL study uses the remote associates test, in which participants have to search through a large knowledge base and use word similarities, occurrences, and co-occurrences to find a solution. The MathPsych study uses the Miller analogies test, in which participants search through a structured knowledge base or an ontology and try to find relational structures that map onto other relational structures to find a solution. These tasks tap into much more complex learning and creativity and intelligence than the paired associates learning task. In conclusion, there is clear evidence of positive peer effects via knowledge and motivation channels. This is great news. We should be able to create emergent effects of combining multiple natural and artificial minds into super minds, as Malone envisioned. Peer-assisted learning may be particularly useful in knowledge-intensive tasks that require large amounts of knowledge and structured knowledge bases or ontologies. However, there is also evidence of negative peer effects via error interference and workload. We need to find ways to mitigate these effects. There are exciting modeling challenges that need to be overcome, such as forming sophisticated beliefs about others and reasoning on them. Thank you for your attention. If you have questions or if you are interested to collaborate with us, please email me.